Hello and welcome to WebTexTube. In this video, we will be covering Redux. First, I will give you a short introduction of what Redux is, then the data flow of Redux, after that the pros and cons of Redux, and finally, I will be importing Redux in our React application. So what is Redux? Redux is an open source JavaScript library for managing and centralizing our application state. It's an independent library. That means it doesn't have any connection with React, Angular, Vue, or any of this framework. But we can use Redux in any of these framework or library. Let's understand Redux with an example. As you can see, we have a diagram here, and in the diagram we have a couple of things over here. The first one is called store, reducer, action, and component. Okay, so as I said that with Redux we have a centralized place where we keep or store all of the state of our application in the store. Okay, so without Redux, previously we had to declare the state in the component, and then we could pass to the nested component, so on and so forth. But with Redux, we no longer declare the state in the component. We declare the state, let's say, the entire state of our application inside the store. This is the centralized storage for our application. From there, excuse me, from the store, we then pass the state to our component. Okay, and then we have an action. Okay, so action is basically a payload or a request to the store, or to the store, let's say, to tell the store that we want to update a value. Okay, and action is nothing but a JavaScript object we will show in a few minutes. Okay, so the action is basically a payload or a JavaScript object that will tell the store that we want to update the state. After that, we have a reducer, which is a function, or pure function to be precise. It basically takes the entire state as a first argument and the action as a second argument, and then it will make a comparison. And after that, if it realizes that you need to update the state, it will then update the state, and it will return the updated state to the store. And from that store, it will then the updated state will then pass to the component. Okay, let's understand with an example. I have created an example for you. Let's say we have a component, and as I said, we need to declare the entire state inside the store, which is called the centralized storage of our application. Let's assume at this point we have declared an age property of 25 in our store. Okay, and we have a component where we have a button, let's say an user using this application who wants to update the value, the age value from 25 to 30. The user then type the value 30 and then click a button, which will then trigger a function. Okay, let's assume we call this function as action creator. Okay, it does nothing except it just create an JavaScript object. Okay, and that JavaScript object is called action. Okay, so whenever we click this button, it will call this function called action creator. It will then create an action, which is a JavaScript object, and this action will then pass to the dispatch function, which is another function which basically takes action as an input and then pass the action to the store. Okay, so let's assume at this point our action has been passed to the store with the help of dispatch function. Okay, so from the store, the action will then pass to the reducer. Okay, at this point, let's assume that reducer is not assume, but let's say it is a function. It is a pure function. So what is a pure function? I will go in a few minutes, but let's understand what a reducer does. So reducer is a function which will take the entire state of our store as first argument, and the action we are passing inside the store as a second argument. So it makes sense. Why? Because we will be storing all of our property inside a JavaScript object, and we are passing an action which is also another JavaScript object. The reducer will then take these two and then will make a comparison. Then reducer will realize then it need to update the state, which will eventually return will update the state and return an updated state. Then reducer will pass this updated state to the store, and from the store we will somehow get the updated state in our component, and then let's say our UI will update the value from 25 to 30. Okay, so so that is how Redux works behind the scene. Okay, let's understand the logic with an example. Let's say you have rented a flat from an agency. Okay, so this is you and this is the agency. Okay, so as soon as you move to the flat, you then realize they gave you a carpeted floor, but you rather like an wooden floor. Okay, at this point, you after a few days you then write an email or message to the agency that you would like to change to the wooden floor. You then write an email, which is an action. Okay, so this is describing that you would like to change your floor from carpeted to wooden. Okay, you will then go to the post office and will post your letter. Okay, and let's say this is your post office. From post office will then deliver your letter to the agency. Your agency will then receive your letter, and from the agency it will then transfer to the correct department or the right department to handle your application. The let's say at this point the correct department, let's call it reducer department or anything like that. Okay, let's assume the right department got your request, and then it then realize, okay, you have requested to update the floor from carpet to wooden. It will then approve your request and then supply all of the instrument and the people or the labor, as you can say, and then it will send them to your house to do the upgrade. Okay, so that's the similar, in my opinion, kind of similar example of how Redux works. Okay, you have a component, and then from that component you want to update the let's say the state which is inside the store. You will create an action using a function called action creator, which we'll be creating in a few minutes in VS Code. Then the function will create an action basically describing what sort of action you want to have and what will be the action value. Okay, so at this point, as you can see in the action, we got two property called type and value. So as you can see, type is nothing but a string, so you do not need to worry about it. It's just a plain JavaScript object. It doesn't do nothing. It will basically tell the store or reducer, to be precise, that we want to do a certain action, we want to trigger a certain function. Let's say we are passing add into the store and then eventually to the reducer. Reducer will receive the action and will look at this type property, which will then return the value of add, and in the reducer function we'll have an if else condition or switch statement where we'll be declaring, like, if the type is add, then we want to add the value of 30, and then we want to update the value. Let's say we are adding the value, replacing the value 30 to 25, to 25 to 30. Okay, that is all action. Okay, so that action will then pass to the dispatch. The dispatch is the function which will then pass to the store. The store will then pass the action to the reducer, and the reducer will then take the initial state or the entire state as a first argument and action as a second argument, and then it will make a comparison and will return a new state or updated state. Okay, so speaking of pure function, as I said, reduce as a pure function. So let me give you an example of, and so you understand what is a pure function. Let's assume, I will do it very quickly. Let's assume we have a function called value, which will take an argument called num, which will then return the num with multiplying by 2. That's all this function does. Excuse me. So as you can see, at this point, it's nothing fancy, nothing new. You will it won't make sense to you. It will say that it will always return 4. So what's the idea about of having this function and calling this function as a pure function? Okay, let's go to the console. As you can see, we got 4, and we reload. As you know, whenever we reload the app, it will basically recall the function, and as many times we refresh or reload the app, as you can see, we always get 4. Okay, so this is a pure function. So let's do the opposite. Let's say at this point we are not we are calling the random method from math, and see what happened at this point. Excuse me. As you can see, we got a value of 0.009 at this point. So let's reload the app. Don't worry, it's rendering 2 times, but let's say we're taking the last value. So as you can see, we get a different value. At this point is 1.648. Let's reload again. As you can see, we get 1.00. So what does it mean? This is an impure function. Why? Because even though we are passing the same input, is returning a different output every single time. So this cannot be happen in pure function, or if, at least in reducer. Why? Because let's say we are passing the initial state and action into our reducer function. Okay, let's say in reducer function we are getting the initial state, which basically has the age value of 25. Okay, and we are getting an action which is a request of the update the value by 30. Okay. Excuse me. So let's say in the reducer function, let's say that the value we are returning is not, at this point we can predict that the the updated value would be 30. Why? Because we are passing 30 and we are defining a function. We are requesting to call this function into the reducer, then that will basically replace the value 25 to 30. Okay, so at that point we can assume that okay, the value would be 30, but let's say at this point we have some different statement into the reducer function, and that will change the value to, let's say, 60. You'll be surprised, or you'll be upset, and you will be thinking, okay, I got a different value, this is not what I wanted. Okay, that's why reducer has to be pure function. It cannot return different value each time. Every time we pass this third value 30 into the reducer function, it always has to be return it always need to return the value 30. It cannot be different every single time. That's why reducer is a pure function. Okay, and another characteristics of pure function is it cannot mutate the original value that is passing inside the function as an argument. Okay, as you can see, we're getting the state, which is the initial state. Okay, let's assume inside the reducer function we are changing the we are mutating the state. Okay, let's say we got two property, okay, age and name. At this point, let's assume we got another property called name. Okay, and inside the function we are mutating the state by updating the replacing the age properties value from 25 to 30, and then we are not doing the immutable way, and that point our name will be gone. So the return updated state will contain only the age property, not name. Okay, so that means reducer cannot mutate the original state or the state that is getting as an argument. It has to be, it can be state, it can be action, it cannot mutate anything. Whatever we're passing, we'll do some update in an immutable way, and then it will return the updated state. Okay, and another thing is about pure function. It cannot depends on a global variable, which is kind of similar. Let's say in the let's say in our application, in somewhere here, okay, we have a variable called num which has a value of 5. Okay, and let's assume we are using this value inside our function, in let's say in our, oh, we are calling num. Okay, and let's call it number. Okay, at this point, let's say we are calling this number excuse me, and let's say that this we are calling this number from a global scope. Okay, and that point at that point, let's assume that this number variable is using by another couple of another function, which means that number could those function could change the number from 5 to any value. Okay, at this point you're passing 2, and you are assuming that 5 times 2 it will return 10, but some other function has already changed it to 5 to 6. That means this value would be different, so it cannot depend on a global variable. Okay, so that is how Redux works, and at this point we have cleared a couple of things already. As you can you will realize that Redux is the pros and cons, as I said, I will go through. So let's quickly realize that. Okay, so at this first point it says Redux make the state predictable. As you already know that is the function is as you can see, reducer is a pure function, so I already explained what is a pure function. So though is getting the same input, it will always return the same output. That's why the Redux state in Redux is predictable. Maintainable, that means let's say we are not using Redux. Okay, we are using we are declaring the state in the component. Okay, and then let's say your application growing very rapidly, and in a few days, I mean in few weeks, your application goes way too larger. At that point, maintaining the state in the component will be quite difficult and very painful. Okay, so if you use Redux in your application, your state will be much more maintainable rather than having declared the state in your component. Debugging, Redux provided a extension called Redux Dev Tools. Okay, I have one here I can show you. Okay, as you can see, is nothing here, but whenever we in a few minutes when we will be working with React, I can show you all the action, and the updated state will be listing here. So let's say we are having a problem in an application, and at this point you can point out in a or narrow down to a very specific function, so we can find out that which action or which function causing the problem. So debugging in Redux is very easy. Performance, of course, one thing I need to mention you earlier, that whenever we declare or create store in our in React application, let's say we are using Redux in our application. Okay, so we have created a store, and then we are hoping that we can we can use the store straight away, but we cannot use the store or Redux straight away. We have to import another library called react-redux. Okay, so this library will allow us to use Redux in application or to access the store from our React application. Okay, so what I mean here is React, what they mean by performance is, let's say whenever let me give you an example. Okay, let's define it here. Sorry, let's say we have bunch of component. Sorry, the color might be changed. Okay, let's say we have bunch of component, and we have a couple. This is our main component, and we have nested component, nested component, and we have some state over here, and this component over here wants to update the state, which will then cause a re-render in this parent component, and eventually let's say we are not using pure functional memo at this point, so that means this component will re-render unnecessarily. Okay, but let's say we are preventing this re-rendering by pure component or React memo, but let's say your application is way too larger. At that point you will be some point you will be get lost. You will be feeling lost. Okay, so whenever we working with Redux, we do not need to worry about that. Why? Because the library called react-redux does this internally automatically for us, so we do not need to worry about it. Okay, so basically we are passing the exact slice of our state in a particular component. So let's say if any let's say we are passing, let's give an example. Okay, let's say we are passing this property or this state in this particular component. Let's say we have a couple of components more, but this component called UI is basically taking this getting access to this to this age property of this state. So whenever this property change, only then this component will update and any other component won't update. So this functionality has been defined by react-redux library automatically for us, so that we do not need to worry about it. Okay, so there is many more pros about the Redux, but as you keep working you will find it out. So debug and maintaining performance is way more flexible than any other library. Okay, so the cons is there is only one cons in my opinion, is the Redux architecture is kind of complicated or complex. So if you have an application, a smaller application, a simpler application where the architecture is not that complex, at that point it's better not to use Redux, because Redux is basically designed for an application where, let's say, you will be needing data from multiple sources, and you have a much more complicated pattern or architecture. At that point you can use Redux. So before you use Redux, you need to decide which sort of application architecture you have, and then you can use Redux. Okay, so now we know what Redux is and how the data flow of Redux, and finally the pros and cons. And now it's time to actually dive into the VS Code, and let's start work with Redux. Okay, so let's see you in the VS Code. Okay, so we are back in the VS Code to implement Redux in our React application. So first we need to install the library in our React application. So for that we have to go to the terminal, and there we have to type that command called npm install --save and then Redux. Okay, and that will basically install the Redux library in our React application in the and after that we can verify in the package.json file. So I have did already, so I'm not doing it again, but I can show you in the package.json file that I have got Redux, which is 4.1.2 in the upper version. Okay, and so excuse me. So as you can see, I have installed already. So it's now time to basically import some method or some function from that Redux library. Okay, so let's call something from Redux, and that something will be a method called create_store. Okay, so let me declare first, then I will explain what's going on here. We are declaring a variable called store, then we are calling that create_store method, and now as you can see it asking for a reducer. Okay, let's explain what's going on here. So what we did here, we imported the create store method from Redux library. So what this method does is it helps us, or let's say it basically create a instance of a store object in our application, okay, and then store in the variable whatever we name, but the convention we always use store. So we are declaring a variable called store, and then we are calling that create store method, okay. And though it's asking for a reducer, we'll be doing it in a few minutes, but let's see. So whenever you're calling that method, so it will create an instance of a store that centralized storage, and then it will store in the variable called store, and from there we can perform many actions. Excuse me. So as you can see, if I call the method again, as you can see, it asking for a reducer, okay. Excuse me. So let's see. In the data flow, as you can see, store is basically depends on a reducer, and as I told you, that the reducer is basically takes the state as an argument, as a first argument, okay. So let's declare store, I mean reducer, then we will see what basically going on, okay. So okay, in the source directory, let's create a folder called reducer, and inside the reducer we will create a file called reducer.js. And as I said, reducer is a function, so let's declare the function first. So it's a reducer that takes two arguments. The first one is the state, and the second will be the action. And finally it will return the state. Whatever happens, it will finally return the state, and then it will export default, export the function as a default, so we can import in our any of our in any file in our React application, okay. Okay, so as you can see, reducer takes a state as an argument, okay. But here's the thing. So if we go to the diagram, as you can see, as I said, the it hold the application state, but that doesn't mean that store has a state of its own, okay. So it hold the application state. What does it mean? That store itself contain reducer, okay. So let's see in this diagram. Okay, sorry. Let's say in this diagram we have a, let's say this is our store, okay, and in the store we have reducer. We may have one reducer, or we may have multiple reducer, okay. So let's say we got multiple reducer, and each of the reducer will then contain an initial state or the JavaScript object, okay. So the store will then combine all the state. Let's say we got state here, state here, state here. So the store will then combine all the state from the reducer, and will make a one giant JavaScript object, or one giant state, okay. So that's why I said the Redux basically hold the application state, the entire application state, okay. So that means we have to declare the initial state in the reducer, not in the store, okay. So that means we have to declare the state in the reducer. So let's declare this the initial state. Then I will name it as initial state, and this is the object, okay. At this point, let's see, we're working on that example. I mean, you see on the diagram. So let's declare the property as 25, okay. And then so we have declared the state already, okay. So here's the thing. So whenever we calling the reducer, okay, so whenever the store trigger an update. So at that point, so the reducer method will be called. Okay, the reducer function will be called. At that point, it will take the initial state as a first argument. Okay, but let's say at some point the initial state, we are not passing any state in the first argument. Okay, let's say the state is not going through the first argument. At that point, if it doesn't go, then if the return state is nothing, then reducer method will return an undefined or null. So that is not good. Okay, so at that point, what we can do, we can set the state permanently to pointing to the initial state. So even though we don't pass anything, or just cause an let's say an update, okay, and then it basically doesn't update anything, okay, and doesn't change any value. At that point, at least it will return the initial state, whatever the state contain. Okay, so for that we have to declare the initial state as a default parameter of this state. Okay, so even though we don't pass anything and we don't have any logic, it will at least return the initial state. Okay, so at this point, our reducer has been created. So let's go to the index.js file and import reducer from the reducer file. Okay, and then we pass the reducer inside that create store method. Okay, so at this point, our store has been created successfully. Okay, to check that, let's print it in the console, and okay, let's print it and let's see what we got here. As you can see, we if you reload the app, as you can see, we got, okay, hang on a second, let me get rid of this. Okay, let's reload the app. Okay, as you can see, we got an object. Okay, so this is the store object. Okay, so this object contains a couple of method or function that rest inside the store object. Okay, it got the dispatch method, which you will be working in a few minutes. Then we got get state and subscribe, replace, reducer, and okay, excuse me. Let's see, and so that means we have successfully created the store. Okay, so let's see that we have declared a initial state with a property of age. Okay, so let's see if we can get the value from in our index.js file. Okay, so as you can see that the store basically provide us some method here, so which one of them is called get state method. Okay, so with the help of this method, we can basically get the let's say the property and the value. Okay, so let's call it in the store then, store dot. If you don't get it by in a suggestion of in the VS Code, don't worry, just call the function. Okay, and then hopefully it will work. And as you can see, we got the this object, or the initial object, from that reducer function. Okay, so that means it's working. Okay, so we got the age property with the value of 25. Okay. Okay, so let's call the get state method again. Read the state tree managed by. Okay, so at this point we can get the value from the reducer, the initial state. So that is basically coming from the store then. Okay, so let's see, at this point we need to update the state from the at this point we are not yet done where we wanted to work with React application. Okay, what do I mean? That at this point Redux will not work with React yet, so we have to import another library, as I mentioned earlier. Okay, but before that I want to show you that the what the basic idea, how we can basically trigger an update or how to get the value. So as you can see, we get the value already. So now it's time to, let's see how we can update the state. Okay, so for that, let's okay, so for that we have to, as I told you in the diagram, as you can see here. Okay, as you can see, at this point the component, though we are not working with React, okay, at this point, but let's see that we want to trigger an update in our store. Okay, at that point we need to send an action, okay, with the help of dispatch method. Okay, so the dispatch method will then take the action, which is a JavaScript object. I had it a couple of minutes earlier, it's gone, however, excuse me. So the action contain a JavaScript object with the property of type and value. Okay, so we will see an action in a few minutes. Okay, so we will pass the action into the dispatch function, which will then send to the store, and eventually it will pass to the reducer to do some updating. Okay, so we will see that in action now. So let's go to the reducer. Okay, so we have to tell the reducer whenever it receives an action what it should do then. Okay, so before it return the entire state, we need to tell them that, as I told you, that we will be having a if-else condition, or let's say the switch statement. Okay, so let's say at this point we are receiving an action, and as I told you that in the diagram, the reducer will basically take the entire state as a first argument, where the state we are passing initial state, and the action will be the action we are passing from the component, or let's say from index.js file. Okay, so the action, whatever we're sending now, it will go to the reducer and then trigger an update. Okay, so let's see if action dot type. Okay, so the best thing is, before we declaring the reducer, let's see excuse me, let's see how we can basically pass an action to the reducer. Okay, for that we have to call the store. As you can see, the store contain an instance of the store, so we have to call that by this variable name. This is now the entire object. Okay, so store, and the function would be dispatch. As I told you, if you don't get any suggestion from the VS Code, don't worry, just keep writing. Okay, and as you can see, dispatch dot whatever, and is asking for an action. Okay, so we are defining the action right now. Okay, as I told you, that the action basically a JavaScript object, where we have to declare two property. The first one would be type. So what this type, as I told you, is it would be a string. Let's say that add at this point. Okay, let's say we passing an add, and we have to pass a value, or let's say payload. Okay, but at this point, let's say we passing value. Okay, we are passing value of 30. Okay, so that is this JavaScript object is the action. So this is the practical action we are sending to the store now. Okay, so that is, we are taking the help of this dispatch function, where we're passing an action. At this point, we're hard coding that action, but whenever we will be working with React, at that point we'll be creating that automatically. Okay, with the help of any, let's say, a button, or any whenever the user inputs something. Okay, so that's the idea. Dispatch function will take an action, which is a JavaScript object, and then we'll pass to the store. Okay, as you can see, we are calling store.dispatch. Okay, excuse me. Okay, at this point, as you can see, we are calling dispatch function, so that means the action is going to the store. Then let's pull up the diagram. Okay, so at this point the action has reached to the store already, right? Very good. Okay, then what the store will do, it will pass that action to the reducer. Okay, that means we are getting the action, we are basically passing that action into the reducer function as a second argument, which is been action. Okay, so that means our reducer function, it is getting an action. Okay, and look at the action property here. Okay, this is an action. Okay, so whenever we call we need to call that type or value property, we have to call the action. Okay, the action is provided by the dispatch function automatically, so when we don't need to write action here. So if we need to, let's say, access the type, so we have to write the action.type. You will see in the reducer right now. Okay, so let's see, let's assume we are calling that action.type. Okay, so whatever we define here, action.type. Okay, so let's see, sorry, action.type is equal add, remember, pay close attention here. We are passing, we are declaring the same value which we basically pass into the type. Okay, it has to match, because this is the basically a flag, or let's say an indicator, that whenever we pass add, we are telling reducer, whenever we pass add to the reducer and do a certain certain work. Okay, so that if you pass, let's say, if you do not pass perfectly, exactly, at that point you will not get this function will not execute. Okay, if the reducer will execute, but it will not, because the statement will not true, then at this point it will do nothing. Okay, so we are saying whenever the action.type will be add, at this point what you should do, you should return, as you can see in the data flow, as you can see in the reducer, as it said, it create new state. Okay, it create new state, it doesn't mutate the state whatever it was in the store. Okay, so it means it takes the state and return a new state. Okay, so that's how reducer work. Okay, excuse me. So this is the new state. Okay, this is the new state, because we're returning a JavaScript object, so that means this is the new state. Okay, so let's see, at this point we got only one property, so we are mutating it. But let's say in your application, you always have to let's say we have to copy the entire state first, and then you can update or override the property you want to update. Okay, so let's say at this point we are doing changing the value of age to let's say, I'm assuming then you are doing something, let's say you are adding some value to the age property. So what you can do is, you can, as you can see, we got access to the age property. Okay, so then what you can do is state.age plus action dot value. Okay, why? Because we are passing the value inside the JavaScript object, which is basically named as action. So if we know, if we want to access a property of a JavaScript object, we have to call that the variable, or let's say okay, so let's say at this point we have type Okay, so this property, though we haven't declared as action, but internally by store dispatch function, it basically named this object as action. Okay, so whenever we're calling action.type, it basically passing this add to the reducer, and whenever we're calling action.value, we are getting this value. Okay, so that's the idea behind it. Okay. Okay, so into the reducer, so as you can see, we are updating the value, and we are adding that value to it. Okay, but in our example, we are not trying to we are not basically adding any value, we are just replacing the value with this value. Okay, but in your case, you might want to, let's say, add some number with it. That's why I basically showed this example. So we need to declare the age property first, and then you do not just pass the value. You have to call that value first. Let's say you want to add 5 with it, then you call that value first, and then you pass that value whichever number you want to add to. Okay, but in my case, I basically want to replace the age property with this value. Okay, so that's all I want to do into the reducer. Okay, so at this point it's done. So whenever it will receive an action, it will look at the action.type property, and whenever it see a is equal to add, whenever this statement is true, reducer will then return this it will return this JavaScript object, which then copy the entire state first, and then whichever property we want to update, it will update that property, and finally it will return that state. Remember, this line is very important. If you do not pass this line, you will get nothing. Okay, so end of the whichever we as you can see, the function body, in the main function of the body, you have to declare the state, return state, otherwise you will not get the state. Okay. Excuse me. Okay, so at this point our reducer is completed. So let's test it in the index.js file. So at this point, as you can see, we are passing and dispatch action. We are passing an action to the store, and after that we are getting the state from the store. So let's see in the console menu whatever we're getting, and as you can see, we are getting the age property of 30 with the value of 30, but previously it was 25. Let me show you. So let's say we are not sending an action. So at this point we are just creating the store and we're getting the state. That means it should be 25. Okay, so let's hit the save. Remember, we are not sending any action at this moment. We are commenting out. Okay, so let's go to the in the console menu. As you can see, the age property is now 25. Okay, so that means we have successfully sent an action to the store. Okay, so that is not the case here, because as I said, we want to import Redux in our React application, and we want to have Redux as a centralized storage in our React application. Okay, so for that we will not get the store, or let's say send in a dispatch function here. For that we need to import another library, as I told you that basically function Redux in our React application, we have to import another library, and that is called, excuse me, it's called react-redux. Okay, so that's the library you need to import in your React project in order to get work with the Redux in a React application. Okay, as I told you that I installed it already. So now it's time to import that in our in the index.js file. I will import something from react-redux library. Okay, so in order to work, as I told you that we want to work with Redux from a React application. Okay, so for that we need to basically wrap our application with a higher order component. Okay, so we need to import that higher order component. I will show you in a minute. Okay, so the higher order component is called provider. Okay, so in the render method, the root render, it's the new render method is from the React 18 version 18. Previously it was React DOM.render, but they changed it a few days ago. Okay, so let's say as I told you that we have to wrap our app component with the provider component. Let me declare it first, then I will explain what's going on. Okay, as you can see, we are wrapping our app component with the provider. But why did we do that? Okay, the reason is Redux is an independent library, as I told you earlier. Okay, at this point we have created the store. Okay, but at this point we cannot straight away working with Redux. Okay, to work with Redux we have to pass the store, this is store object into the app component. Okay, for that we are taking help of this provider component, which is a higher order component, and that is returning the app component as their child. Okay, so that's what they are doing. Okay, and inside the provider method, provider component, it takes a prop. As you can see, it's taking a props called store. Okay, let me declare it first and I will explain. Okay, it's not super complicated. What it does basically, it basically pass the store object or instance of the store object into the provider component. This is the higher order component, and this higher order component then pass the store or the functionality of store into the app component. Okay, that's all it does. Okay, at this point we have basically we are done with the provider side. Okay, and now let's say that we are importing basically we are accessing the store from the app component. It basically work with any component, but as for sake of simplicity I will just import in the app component, as this video is getting quite longer. So let's import something from, again I'm taking help of the React Redux library. Okay, so we have a wrap our app component already. Okay, and then okay, one more thing again, as you can see we have wrap our app component with the provider, but and whatever component you declare after that, it should be nested inside the app component, so we don't have to wrap every single component with provider. So we do once first, and then every single component nested inside the app component will get access to the store. Okay, so let's say we are importing a method called connect. Okay, that's the very interesting and very confusing things. Okay, so we are importing connect method, connect function from React Redux library. Okay, pay very strict attention here. Okay, so as you can see, we are importing connect method from the React Redux library. So what is this connect? Okay, this connect method, this is basically a higher order function. Okay, a higher order function that basically in one of my video I went through a concept called the carrying a function. Okay, or carrying function. Okay, so this is one of the another example of carrying function. Okay, so this is basically a higher order component. This connect, it basically takes a couple of multiple function as an argument, and then it basically return a function, because Redux basically is built on a functional programming paradigm. Okay, so let's say in the export default line, whenever we finally exporting our app, at that point we want to call that connect function. Note that I'm not wrapping the app component in inside our connect method. Instead we are calling the connect method. Will pass some function in a few minutes, but let's say connect function will first, let's have some space over here just to show you an idea. Okay, the connect function will take some function which we will declare here in a few minutes, and then that function will pass in the connect method. Then it will call, I mean, it will invoke with this argument with the function we're passing here. Then it will basically return another function. Okay, and that function will basically take app as a component. Okay, so let's say in the previous video I went through let's say something like that. Let's say name, and then let's say I basically return a function. Okay, so that return another function which takes another argument. Okay, and then return something. Okay, just to give you a general idea. Then let's say it does something. Okay, so this is a carrying method or carrying function. Okay, so the basically the name, let's rename it with connect, so you don't get confused. So this connect method will take in some argument, which let's say we are passing some argument. It will take an argument and then it will return another function. Okay, and that function that return from the connect function will take this app as an argument over here. Let's say it's taking app as an argument, and then it will basically return something. Okay, and in this return it basically providing or supplying the entire store object inside inside our app component, and then we can basically get access to the store. Okay, I hope that will make sense in a few minutes whenever we finish with it. Okay, so that is done over here. So as I told you that we need to pass some function over here. Okay, so previously as you saw that we basically declare some we basically get called the store.getState method. Okay, and then we send an action using dispatch. Okay, so that is not the case whenever we're working with React. Okay, so whenever we're working with React, we are basically taking help of the connect function, and as I said, connect function takes some function as an argument and returns some function, and that function basically pass those state from the store in our app component as a props. As you can see, we are taking props. It passing the why we are declaring the connect at the end of the line in the export default line. Why? Because the app, whenever the functional component app render, it basically pass the entire state as a props inside the app component, and then we can use, I will show you in a few minutes. Let's say we are calling that we have to declare as it's, let's see in the diagram. As you can see, sorry, I think I'm over explaining it, but I think you need to have the general idea. Okay, as I told you, whenever I click the button, at that point we want to send some action. At this point it will basically call an function which is the create action. Okay, it will basically create an action, and I didn't tell you that whenever which will be the case when we want to get the state from our store. Okay, at that point we are basically taking help of this connect method. Okay, so what this connect method does, redux. Okay, as you can see, we are not going through the description over here, but let's see the argument over here. As you can see, function connect. Okay, so it takes couple of method as an argument, all optional. Okay, so let's see the first argument. Whatever we are passing the first argument, what it does, as you can see, map state to props. It will basically let's see, we are passing the age property from the store to the app component. Okay, so that at that point we're taking help of this connect. Okay, so what will you do? Let me declare first, then I will you will see what I mean by this. Okay, so let's say we are declaring a function called map state to props. Okay, so that will then basically take a state as an argument, and then it will return something. But before return something, this map state to props, it's a convention. You can use any name you want, but it's better to use map state to props. Why? Because if somebody using your code later on, you will have a clear idea what's going on. Okay, excuse me. Okay, so this function will then return an object. Okay, so what this object is basically, let me declare it first. Let's say in the return statement we are passing a props name. Yes, it's a props name. Okay, so let's say we are calling age value. Age value will be state dot age. It doesn't make sense at this point. Okay, but let me explain you. So we are passing this map state to props in our connect method. Okay, then whenever we passing the state, this function connect will basically take this function that we have declared over here, and then it will basically as I said, it will return another function. Okay, and that function will basically get the state from the store. Connect does this automatically for us. Okay, so it will basically pass the state from the store and it basically map that state. Okay, as you can see, we are mapping, we are declaring the name is up to you. We are mapping this state dot age as a props name age value. Okay, so whatever we're passing in this argument as a function, and we have to declare is like that. So that point is connect method will map the state from the store and from the store to props called age value. Okay, let me show you. In the function component, let's say we are printing the console, which will be age value. Oh, sorry. Now hit save in index.js, hit save, and let's go to our React application, reload the app, and as you can see, we are getting it from app.js now line 6. Okay, so app.js line 6 console log props.age value. So props.age value we have declared in the map state to props. So now we have the idea how it works. Okay, so what it does, we are passing this function into the connect method, and then connect method will then take this function and pass the state from our store, and it will map the state as a props value. I mean the props called age value to this state dot age. Okay, so we could call state, then it will basically map the entire state as a props in our age value. So okay, so it is basically same as with our Redux. Let's say we have component over here. The very short example, sorry I'm getting a bit wordy, but let's say this is our state. Okay, and then this is our child component, so we need to pass some state from the props. So at that point we have to pass some state. Let's say we're calling the child component is our parent component. At that point we have to declare, I mean pass the state as a props. So this state is basically injecting inside the component as a props, whichever name we give it. So this is exactly the same idea over here. Okay, so that is the first argument. As I said, it takes another argument. So at this point we are getting the state from the store. That is done. Brilliant. Okay, so how about if we want to update the state, or let's say we want to send an action. Okay, at this point we need to declare another function which called map dispatch to props. Okay, map dispatch to props, which will then which will then basically take the I think it's an action. Okay, let's just forget about the action. Let's declare the function. Okay, so what this method will do, it will return another JavaScript object where as you can see, map dispatch to props. Again, this name could be anything, but it's convention to use map dispatch to props. So what it does, it basically map the dispatch the action we are sending to props, to a props. So let's say in our React application, we want to update the state from the child component. So we have to pass a function from the main component as a props to our component. The same idea goes here. So whenever we want to send some action, we have to call a method. Okay, so for that we have to give a props first. Okay, let's say I call it add. Okay, so this is our props, and this will map to an action. Okay, as I told you, that action is, this is our action. This will be our JavaScript object inside our dispatch function. So we need to declare the dispatch whole function whole inside that props. Okay, so sounds a bit confusing, but here's the general idea. If you go to the documentation of Redux Connect, if you go down a bit, as you can see, we got map dispatch to props. Okay, it return object or dispatch. Okay, no, it basically return, it takes a function or object. Okay, so what's the idea here? As you can see, it takes a dispatch as an argument. So what is this dispatch? Okay, so whenever we are passing the map dispatch to props, you can pass it null if you want to, or you can leave it empty. But if you pass map dispatch to props in the connect method over here, let's say we're declaring here first map dispatch to props. Okay, so whenever we are passing the argument inside the connect method will first pass the dispatch function inside the map dispatch to props. Let's an argument. Let's say we are naming it as dispatch, because we are basically getting the dispatch function from the connector function. Okay, so again, the whole idea is whenever we calling the second argument here, and whenever this function, the component re-render or the lesser render, at that point connect internally will pass the dispatch function from the store inside this map dispatch to props. Okay, and then we can basically use that dispatch function to send an action. Okay, so I think it will be I hope you get the idea clear. Okay, so at this point you will be lost. Okay, so you will be saying where the dispatch is coming from. So it is not weird, because it makes sense. Connect is basically passing that dispatch function inside the map dispatch to props, okay, automatically for us. And what about this add? Okay, and it also connect basically does basically two works at a time at initially. Okay, so it basically pass the dispatch as a function inside our component, inside inside that function, and then it basically pass the add inside our function component as a props. Okay, so whenever we are calling add, it knows that, okay, let's say I will show you in a few minutes. Okay, let's declare the statement first. Okay, so whenever we're calling this props.add, it will execute a function, an anonymous arrow function, or let's say arrow function, and this function will then call dispatch function. Okay, so this is the general idea. It will then call the dispatch function, which is nothing but a JavaScript object, because we are sending an action. An action will hold basically a type, which we will name it, let's say add, and then you can name it as payload. Okay, and then you can name it value, let's say the convention is, if you have multiple value inside, you want to send to the store, at that point people use payload instead of value, or some, it basically depends on people. However you want to use it is nothing hard and fast rules, but I prefer to use payload, but as I'm sending just one value, at that point where I'm just sending one, I'm just writing as a value. Okay, so that's the idea. So this is an action, as I show you in the previous video, in few minutes earlier. And this is the dispatch function we are getting as an argument from the connect function. The connect function basically pass the dispatch function inside the map dispatch to props, and from there we are calling the props.add. In somewhere in our application we'll call that props.add, and and that point it will call this function, this arrow function. It will call this function, okay, and it will then call the dispatch function, and the dispatch function will take an action as an argument, and it will then send to the store. Okay, so that's the general idea. Okay, so at this point let's hit save. Okay, before that, as I told you, we need to have a button somewhere, or an event handler, then we can see that it basically working. Okay, for that let's say button, let's say we name it add, and we are adding a on-click event handler, and now it makes sense, I guess, props.add. Why? Because map dispatch to props, whenever connect calling that map dispatch to props, it will pass the dispatch as a dispatch function as a dispatch argument inside the function, and it will pass the add as a props inside our apps. So whenever we need to call the add function, we have to call as props.add. That's all it means. Let's hit save, and let's go to the in our application. Okay, so I'm hoping it will work. So let's click on add. As you can see, it working, is adding 30. Okay, and every time we call that, I think it will add 30. Okay, as you can see 30, but let's say we are incrementing, so it makes sense. Okay, let's say keep the name of type add at this point, and value will be incrementing by 5, let's say. Okay, and inside the reducer, whenever it's add, we are getting back to the previous logic I showed you at the beginning. State.age plus action.value. Okay, I think at this point it will make sense. Excuse me. Okay, as you can see, at this point we got value of 25, but whenever we click on add, all right, as you can see, it's working. Beautiful. Okay, 35, 40, 45, 50, so on and so forth. Okay, so that's the general idea of Redux. Okay, as this video went too much longer. Okay, so that's the basic idea how to use Redux in our React application, and my main aim was to explain Redux as much as I could. I hope that let me think if I missed something. No. Okay, that's basically it. So I hope that I was able to explain Redux as much, as clearly as I could. Okay, so if you have any confusion, like the best idea would be to go through the documentation and go each line, read through each line, pay attention to the line one by one, and then you will have the general idea. Okay, but as I told you earlier, that if you have a complicated architecture, then it's best to use Redux. But if you have simpler architecture where you're passing data from one data source, then it's better to not use Redux, stick to the state declaration in the component. Okay, and then if you have too much props drilling, at that point you can use context API, or sometimes you can take help of the local storage of session storage, which is if a bit tricky, but if you read to the documentation clearly, then I hope then you will be you will not face any problem. Okay, so I hope this video will help you a bit. I was trying to explain as much clearly as I could. Okay, so if you like this video, please hit the like button and subscribe if you like, and if you have any question, then please write them in the comment section below, and I will try my best to answer them. Okay, till then, keep learning and keep coding, and see you in the next video. Goodbye.